My friends, I want to tell you about a habit I carried for most of my adult life, one that I was convinced was simply a sign of respect and good character. Whenever I made a decision my family did not immediately understand, I explained it. I explained why I chose to sell the house instead of keeping it in the family. I explained why I decided to travel instead of saving every last coin for my grandchildren's future. I explained why I stopped attending certain gatherings, why I chose a different doctor, why I spent my Sunday afternoons the way I chose to spend them rather than the way someone expected. I believed, with complete sincerity, that if I simply explained myself clearly enough, patiently enough, thoroughly enough, my family would eventually understand, and once they understood, the tension between us would finally dissolve. It was only after I passed 70 years old that I began to notice something troubling. The more I explained myself, the more questions I seemed to invite. The more reasons I offered, the more my family seemed to search for holes in those reasons, as though my explanation were a proposal up for debate rather than simply a decision I had already made. I would leave these conversations exhausted, having said far more than I intended, having revealed far more of my private reasoning than I was comfortable sharing, and somehow still feeling less understood than before I had opened my mouth at all. It took me a painful, humbling stretch of my early 70s to finally understand what was actually happening. Explaining myself was not building bridges the way I believed it was. It was quietly signaling, every single time, that my decisions required their approval before they could stand on their own. It was inviting them to weigh in on choices that were never actually theirs to weigh in on. And worse, it was teaching everyone around me, including myself, that my peace depended on winning them over with the right argument, rather than simply standing calmly and quietly in my own choices. So today, I want to share with you what I learned once I finally stopped explaining myself the way I always had. This is not a lesson about becoming cold, distant, or secretive with the people you love. It is a lesson about the difference between sharing your life honestly and defending your life anxiously, a difference I did not understand until I had spent decades confusing the two. Take from this what speaks to you, and leave what does not. Every family is different, and every relationship within a family carries its own particular history. But I believe, after 70 years of living and many painful conversations, that this lesson applies to nearly all of us in one form or another. The first thing I understood was that explaining myself had quietly become a habit of anxiety rather than a habit of honesty. I used to believe I was explaining myself because I valued transparency. But looking back honestly, most of my explanations were fueled by a nervous hope that if I just found the right words, I could prevent any disapproval before it even had the chance to form. Genuine honesty does not need to convince anyone of anything. It simply states the truth calmly and lets it stand. What I had been practicing for years was something closer to quiet begging dressed up as openness. The second thing I understood was that every explanation I offered was quietly being treated as an invitation to debate. Whenever I explained my reasoning fully, I noticed my family did not simply receive the explanation and move on. They examined it, questioned pieces of it, offered counterpoints, as though I had submitted a proposal for their consideration rather than informed them of a decision I had already made. The moment I stopped offering full explanations and instead simply stated my decisions plainly, I noticed the debates that used to follow almost entirely disappeared, because there was nothing left to argue with. The third thing I understood was that over-explaining had taught my family to expect a defense from me every single time. The more thoroughly I justified my choices in the early years, the more my family came to expect that same thorough justification going forward, as though it had become a required part of any conversation about my life. When I finally began stating things simply, without the usual lengthy defense, some of them were surprised at first. But surprise slowly gave way to acceptance, because I was no longer teaching them, through my own behavior, that my decisions were always up for negotiation. The fourth thing I understood was that explaining myself excessively often revealed more vulnerability than I actually intended to share. In my effort to justify a decision fully, I would sometimes disclose private fears, private doubts, private financial details, or private health concerns that I had not originally planned to share, simply because I felt cornered into providing a complete picture. Later, I often regretted having said so much. I learned that I could share the outcome of a decision honestly without feeling obligated to hand over every private thought that led me there. The fifth thing I understood was that my explanations were rarely actually changing anyone's mind. I used to believe that if I could just phrase things correctly, my family would finally see things the way I did. But after 70 years, I can count on one hand the number of times a lengthy explanation actually shifted someone's opinion of my choices. Mostly, people believe what they already believe, and no amount of careful wording changes that nearly as often as we hope it will. Once I accepted this, the pressure to find the perfect explanation finally lifted. The sixth thing I understood was that repeated explaining was quietly training me to doubt my own decisions. Each time I rehearsed my reasoning out loud to satisfy a skeptical relative, I found myself, almost without noticing, searching for weaknesses in my own logic, second-guessing choices I had actually felt quite settled about before the conversation began. Explaining myself over and over did not strengthen my confidence in my decisions. It slowly eroded it, planting small seeds of doubt that had not been there before I opened my mouth. The seventh thing I understood was that silence, used wisely, communicates a confidence that no explanation ever could. When I finally began responding to questions about my choices with a calm, brief acknowledgement rather than a lengthy defense, I noticed something remarkable. My steadiness itself became the message. People often trust a decision more when it is delivered without desperate justification than when it arrives wrapped in 3 paragraphs of anxious reasoning. The eighth thing I understood was that some family members were not actually asking for an explanation at all. They were asking for reassurance, and I had been answering the wrong question. When my daughter questioned my decision to move to a smaller home, I used to respond with logistics, finances, and practical reasoning. Eventually, I realized she was not actually confused about my reasoning. She was worried about losing a piece of her own childhood home and needed comfort, not data. Once I began addressing the real feeling underneath the question, my long explanations became unnecessary entirely. The ninth thing I understood was that over-explaining often signaled guilt I did not actually need to carry. I noticed that I explained myself most elaborately in moments when I secretly felt a flicker of guilt about disappointing someone, even when the decision itself was completely reasonable and well within my right to make. The lengthy explanation was really an attempt to earn forgiveness for a decision that required no forgiveness at all. Recognizing this pattern helped me separate legitimate accountability from unnecessary self-punishment disguised as thoroughness. The 10th thing I understood was that my adult children did not need the same level of explanation from me that I once needed to give them as young parents guiding them through childhood. For so many years, explaining my reasoning to my children had been an important part of teaching them how to think. But somewhere along the way, I never adjusted this habit for the fact that they were no longer children needing guidance. They were grown adults, and I no longer owed them the same exhaustive reasoning I once offered a curious 10-year-old asking why the sky was blue. The 11th thing I understood was that brevity did not mean coldness, no matter how it initially felt to practice it. At first, giving a short, calm answer instead of my usual long explanation felt almost rude to me, as though I were withholding something I owed. But I came to see that warmth lives in tone, presence, and care, not in the length of a justification. I could say very little and still be entirely loving in how I said it. The 12th thing I understood was that some questions from family were not sincere questions at all, but quiet attempts to reopen a decision that had already been settled. When my brother repeatedly asked why I had chosen a particular caregiver for myself, long after the decision was made and working well, I realized his question was not seeking new information. It was hoping, through repetition, that I might eventually change my mind. Once I recognized this pattern, I stopped supplying fresh explanations to a question that was never really asking for one. The 13th thing I understood was that over-explaining often made the other person feel entitled to have the final say. Each additional reason I gave subtly implied that if they simply found a strong enough counterargument, my decision might change. This unintentionally placed the final authority over my own life into their hands rather than my own. Speaking plainly, without an open invitation for rebuttal, restored the authority over my choices to where it belonged all along, with me. The 14th thing I understood was that my worth was never actually dependent on my family fully understanding every decision I made. For years, I felt an unspoken pressure that if my family did not understand something about my life, it reflected poorly on me somehow, as though a good, respectable person should always be able to make their reasoning perfectly clear to everyone around them. But understanding is not required for love, and it is certainly not required for respect. Some of the people who love me most will simply never fully understand certain choices I make, and I have finally made peace with that reality. The 15th thing I understood was that constant explaining had quietly become a substitute for genuine emotional closeness. I noticed I explained my reasoning far more often than I shared my true feelings. It felt safer to offer logic than vulnerability. But logic rarely deepens a relationship the way honest feeling does. When I began saying simply, "This was hard for me, and I appreciate your patience," instead of a long justification, I found my relationships grew warmer, not colder, despite saying far less than before. The 16th thing I understood was that my family's discomfort with my decision was not automatically evidence that my decision was wrong. For years, I treated any visible discomfort from a relative as a signal that I needed to explain further until the discomfort disappeared. But other people's temporary discomfort with a choice that is genuinely mine to make is not proof of anything except that change is often uncomfortable. I learned to let their discomfort exist without treating it as my responsibility to immediately resolve. The 17th thing I understood was that over-explaining sometimes disguised a desire for control rather than a desire for connection. If I could simply explain thoroughly enough, I secretly believed I could control how my family felt about a decision and how they behaved afterward. But feelings cannot truly be controlled through explanation, only influenced gently at best. Releasing this hidden hope for control allowed me to speak far more simply, because I was no longer trying to manage an outcome that was never actually mine to manage. The 18th thing I understood was that repeating an explanation to a family member who has already rejected it once rarely produces a different result the second or third time. I used to believe that if my first explanation failed to satisfy someone, a more detailed second attempt might finally succeed. In reality, if someone has already decided not to accept a decision, additional explanation usually just prolongs an argument rather than resolving it. I learned to say my piece once, clearly and kindly, and then let it rest. The 19th thing I understood was that my tone mattered far more than the content of what I said. A short, calm statement delivered with warmth communicated far more respect and love than a long, anxious explanation delivered while my hands were shaking. Family members respond to the emotional temperature of a conversation as much as to its actual words. Learning to keep my tone steady, even while saying less, changed the entire atmosphere of these conversations. The 20th thing I understood was that I could acknowledge someone's feelings about my decision without reopening the decision itself. For years, I believed that acknowledging a family member's disappointment obligated me to reconsider or further justify my choice. But I learned I could say simply, "I understand this is disappointing for you," and then let the decision remain exactly as it was, without contradiction. Acknowledgement and agreement are two entirely different things, and I finally learned how to offer one without surrendering to the other. The 21st thing I understood was that over-explaining often exhausted me far more than it ever helped my family. I would leave these lengthy conversations depleted, having relived every doubt and fear behind a decision I had already made peace with privately. The cost to my own energy and peace of mind was rarely matched by any real benefit to the relationship. Once I recognized this imbalance clearly, protecting my own energy became just as important to me as protecting the relationship itself. The 22nd thing I understood was that a decision explained too many times begins to sound less certain, even to the person who made it. I noticed that after explaining the same choice for the 5th or 6th time to different relatives, my own voice began to carry a note of uncertainty that had not been there the first time I said it. Repetition, rather than reinforcing my confidence, slowly wore it down. Saying something once, clearly, preserved far more conviction than saying it 5 times with mounting exhaustion. The 23rd thing I understood was that my adult siblings were capable of disagreeing with me and still remaining close to me, without requiring my constant justification to bridge the gap. I used to believe that any unresolved disagreement would slowly poison the relationship if I did not eventually convince them I was right. But some of my closest sibling relationships today still carry small, unresolved disagreements we simply choose not to revisit, and the closeness has not suffered for it in the least. The 24th thing I understood was that saying "this is what I've decided" was not the same as saying "I don't care what you think." For a long time, I avoided plain statements like this because I feared they sounded dismissive or harsh. But I learned that a plain, calm statement of a settled decision, delivered with warmth, communicates confidence rather than coldness. It was my own anxious over-explaining, not a simple clear statement, that had actually been creating distance in these relationships all along. The 25th thing I understood was that I did not need unanimous family approval before I was allowed to feel at peace with my own choice. I used to wait, almost unconsciously, for every relative's blessing before I would let myself fully relax into a decision. But unanimous approval rarely arrives for any meaningful decision in life. Learning to feel settled internally, regardless of how many family members had fully come around, freed me from a waiting period that could have lasted the rest of my life. The 26th thing I understood was that over-explaining to one family member often meant repeating the same defense to several others in turn, multiplying my exhaustion many times over. Word travels within families, and I noticed that if I gave an elaborate justification to one relative, others soon expected the same treatment, each believing they too deserved a full accounting. Once I began responding briefly and consistently to everyone, this exhausting cycle of repeated defenses finally came to an end. The 27th thing I understood was that my privacy in my later years was not something I needed anyone's permission to protect. For years, I felt a strange obligation to make my entire life visible and explainable to my family, as though privacy at this stage of life was somehow selfish or secretive. But I came to believe that a person is allowed to keep certain decisions, certain finances, certain private matters entirely their own, without owing a full accounting to anyone, however much they are loved. The 28th thing I understood was that over-explaining to avoid conflict often created a slower, quieter form of conflict instead. I believed that thorough explanation was the path around disagreement. But in reality, my lengthy justifications often bred subtle resentment on both sides. Resentment from my family, who felt they were being managed rather than simply informed, and resentment from me, who felt endlessly cross-examined. A brief, honest statement, though it occasionally caused an immediate small friction, rarely produced this slower, more corrosive resentment over time. The 29th thing I understood was that some family members respected me more, not less, once I stopped explaining myself so thoroughly. I feared that speaking plainly would come across as arrogant or dismissive. Instead, several relatives told me, quite unexpectedly, that they had come to respect my calm certainty more than they ever respected my long, anxious justifications. Confidence, delivered gently, earned a kind of respect that endless explanation never had. The 30th thing I understood was that I could offer context without offering a full defense. There is a difference between saying, "I'm choosing to sell the house because it no longer suits my needs," and launching into a 20-minute defense covering every financial detail, every emotional consideration, and every anticipated objection. I learned to offer a single honest sentence of context, and then to trust that sentence to stand on its own, without needing to fortify it further. The 31st thing I understood was that my need to be fully understood was, in many ways, a need I had to learn to release rather than fulfill. For most of my life, I believed the goal was to eventually be perfectly understood by everyone I loved. But some parts of any person's inner life remain genuinely difficult for others to fully grasp, no matter how well explained. I learned to accept partial understanding as simply part of being a complex human being loved by other complex human beings, rather than a problem still waiting to be solved through more words. The 32nd thing I understood was that over-explaining sometimes came from a fear of being seen as selfish, and this fear needed examining rather than appeasing. Each time I chose something purely for my own well-being, a trip, a purchase, a boundary, I felt compelled to explain it thoroughly enough to prove I was not being selfish. But making reasonable choices for one's own well-being later in life is not selfishness. Once I stopped treating self-care as something requiring a defense, the urge to over-explain these choices largely disappeared on its own. The 33rd thing I understood was that my calm, brief responses actually modeled a healthier way of handling disagreement for my grandchildren, who were quietly watching how I handled these moments. I noticed my grandchildren observing family conversations closely, absorbing lessons about conflict and confidence simply by watching the adults around them. Choosing calm brevity over anxious over-explanation offered them a quiet example of how a person can hold a boundary with warmth rather than either aggression or endless justification. The 34th thing I understood was that some explanations I used to give were really apologies in disguise, apologizing for decisions that required no apology at all. Phrases like, "I know this might seem strange, but," or "I hope you don't think less of me for," were, underneath their polite wrapping, quiet apologies for simply living my own life. I learned to notice this pattern and gently remove the hidden apology, leaving behind only the honest, unapologetic truth of my decision. The 35th thing I understood was that a decision explained too eagerly, too quickly, often signals anxiety more than it signals confidence, and family members can sense this difference even if they cannot name it. When I rushed to explain myself the moment a decision was questioned, I noticed my family responded with more scrutiny, almost as though my urgency invited them to dig further. When I instead paused calmly before responding briefly, that same pause communicated a steadiness that quietly discouraged further interrogation. The 36th thing I understood was that explaining a decision to a family member before I had even fully settled it in my own mind often invited them into a debate that belonged to me alone. There were times I spoke my half-formed reasoning aloud too early, still genuinely uncertain myself, and my relatives naturally treated my uncertainty as an open invitation to help me decide. I learned to settle a decision quietly within myself first, and only share it with family once it was already firm, which left far less room for anyone to talk me out of something I had already chosen. The 37th thing I understood was that I sometimes over-explained to family members who were, in truth, simply venting their own unrelated frustrations through the conversation about my choices. When my nephew questioned my decision to stop driving at night, I later realized his sharpness had little to do with me and far more to do with his own private anxiety about aging parents in his wife's family. Recognizing that some pointed questions are really about the asker's own fears helped me stop searching for a perfect explanation to a question that was never really mine to fully answer. The 38th thing I understood was that written messages tempted me into far longer explanations than a spoken conversation ever did, and this length rarely served me well. A text message or letter gave me too much room to keep adding one more justification, one more clarifying sentence, until a simple update had grown into several paragraphs of anxious reasoning. I learned to draft these messages, then delete at least half of what I had written before sending them, keeping only the plain, essential truth of what I wanted to say. The 39th thing I understood was that my own parents, in their final years, had quietly taught me this lesson long before I was ready to learn it, and I simply had not been listening. I remember my mother, in her 80s, responding to a pointed question about her finances with nothing more than a calm, "That's settled, dear, and I'm at peace with it." At the time, I thought her answer was almost dismissive. Only decades later did I understand she had already mastered exactly the steadiness I was still struggling to learn for myself. The 40th thing I understood was that over-explaining often robbed a decision of the dignity it deserved. A choice made after careful thought, perhaps after years of quiet reflection, deserved to be spoken plainly and respected, not picked apart sentence by sentence in an anxious defense. I came to feel that my most meaningful decisions, the ones I had wrestled with longest in private, were actually diminished by lengthy public justification, as though the weight of the decision could only be honored by simplicity, not elaboration. The 41st thing I understood was that I could love someone deeply and still decline to give them a full account of my private reasoning, and that these two things were never actually in conflict. For years I believed that withholding a complete explanation from someone I loved was a small betrayal of the closeness between us. I have since come to believe the opposite. A love secure enough to withstand a few unexplained corners is a far sturdier love than one that requires constant, anxious transparency to survive. And the 42nd thing, the final lesson I want to leave you with today, is this. After 70, your life no longer requires a defense, it only requires your presence. For decades, I confused presence with persuasion, believing that being truly present with my family meant constantly justifying myself to them. But presence is something far simpler and far more valuable than persuasion. It is showing up, loving them honestly, sharing what feels natural to share, and allowing the rest of my life to remain quietly, peacefully mine, without needing anyone's argument to approve of it first. My friends, I want to be clear that none of this is an invitation to become distant, secretive, or cold with the people you love. Sharing your life with your family, your joys, your struggles, your reasoning when it feels natural to share it, remains one of the deepest gifts of a close family relationship. What I am describing today is not the end of openness. It is the end of anxious, excessive justification offered out of fear rather than genuine desire to share. I think back often to a particular afternoon in my early 70s, sitting at my sister's kitchen table, being asked once again why I had chosen to spend my savings on travel rather than leaving a larger inheritance behind. In earlier years, I would have launched into a careful, defensive explanation covering every financial and emotional angle. Instead, that afternoon, I simply said, "This is what brings me joy in the years I have left, and I've made my peace with it." And then, remarkably, I said nothing further. My sister sat with this for a moment, and rather than the argument I had braced myself for, she simply nodded, poured more tea, and the conversation moved gently on to something else entirely. That small moment taught me more about peace within a family than 1,000 careful explanations ever had. I had spent so many years believing that peace required agreement, and agreement required justification. But peace, I finally understood in my 70s, requires something far simpler. It requires each of us to stand steadily and kindly in our own life, without needing everyone around the table to fully sign off on every choice we make before we are allowed to feel settled in it. There is a particular kind of freedom that arrives once you finally set this old habit down, one I did not expect and could not have described to you before I experienced it myself. Conversations that once left me rehearsing my defense for hours beforehand became simple exchanges I no longer dreaded. Family gatherings that once felt like small courtrooms became, once again, places of genuine warmth. I had not realized how much of my own joy in these relationships had been quietly buried underneath decades of anxious justification, until I finally stopped digging that particular hole and let the joy rise back to the surface on its own. If you are watching this today and you recognize this old habit in yourself, the endless explaining, the anxious justifying, the quiet hope that just one more well-chosen sentence might finally earn someone's understanding, I want you to know it is not too late to set this habit down. You do not need to abandon your family to do this. You simply need to trust that your decisions can stand quietly on their own, held up by your own steady presence rather than by an ever-lengthening list of reasons. Start small, if that feels safer. The next time someone questions a minor decision, try answering in a single calm sentence, and notice, gently, how much less you need to say than you once believed. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared brings you a little more courage to speak simply, a little more peace with what remains unexplained, and a little more confidence in the quiet authority of your own life. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Love your families fully. Just remember that after a certain point, your life no longer needs their permission, only their presence beside you, and yours beside them. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay honest, stay steady, and remember, the fewer words we need to feel certain, the more certain we have truly become. Thank you for watching.